The marina smelled of diesel and warm salt, and Nora Quinn was 11 minutes from losing the only chance she had left. She knew it was 11 minutes because she had been counting backward from the moment her bus coughed her out at Sable Point, with a dead phone and a folder of references already curling at the corners in the June heat. The interview was at 9. The crossing to Renmore took 40 minutes. The ferry left at 8:15, and the harbour clock above the bait shop said 8:13, and there were 2 boats at the long pier, and she had exactly enough breath left to run for one of them. She picked the nearer one. It was a low white launch with a name she didn't stop to read, a brass rail going green at the joints, and a gangplank already half pulled in. She threw her bag across the gap, then herself after it, landing hard enough to bark her shin on a cleat, and she said a word her mother would not have liked. And then she straightened up and squared her shoulders, and tried to look like a person who boarded boats on purpose. There was only one other passenger aboard. A man, maybe in his middle 30s, sitting on the bench by the wheelhouse with a coffee in his hands, and the unbothered stillness of someone who had never in his life been 11 minutes from anything. Dark hair the wind had given up on, a canvas jacket gone soft with age. He watched her sprint, watched her land, watched her swear, and he did not change his expression by so much as a degree, which she decided she appreciated. "Is this the Renmore ferry?" she asked. She was still breathing in pieces. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes and then went still again, the way water settles. "It's going to Renmore," he said. It wasn't a yes, not exactly, and some tired part of her catalogued the gap even as the rest of her went weak with relief. The deck rocked under her shins. The salt air sat cold and clean on the back of her tongue after the diesel reek of the pier, and the brass rail under her palm had gone slick with morning damp. She told herself the careful phrasing was just a quiet man being precise. She had a whole life of telling herself the small, wrong thing rather than miss a boat she couldn't afford to miss. Thank God. She dropped onto the bench opposite him, pen already behind her ear out of pure habit, and pressed a hand flat against her sternum as though she could hold her heart down by force. "I thought I was going to have to swim. Do you know if they hold the 9 o'clocks? For the house? If you're late, I mean." "They don't hold much," he said. "Right. Of course they don't. Why would they?" She closed her eyes, opened them. The engine note dropped, and the pier began, very gently, to slide away. And the relief that went through her was so complete, it was almost grief. Okay, I'm on. I'm on a boat that is going to the island. Everything after this is solvable. The man turned his coffee a quarter turn in his hands and didn't answer. But she had the sense he was listening in a way most people didn't bother to. And because she was wrung out and the adrenaline had nowhere left to go, she kept talking. The launch found the open water, and the world changed under her. The swell came up long and slow, and the bench lifted, and set her down again, with a patience that loosened something behind her ribs. Spray broke off the bow and beaded cold on her wrists. The wind smelled of kelp and far-off rain. She should have been rehearsing answers for the interview, she knew. Covers, counts, what she'd say when the silver-haired woman asked why she'd left her last place. Instead, she watched a man she'd never see again hold a coffee he wasn't drinking, and let the talking carry her, because talking was cheaper than thinking about how little stood between her and the water. "I'm interviewing for the seasonal post up at the big house, the Thorn place. Events and house coordination," it said in the listing, which I think means I'll be ironing tablecloths and counting forks until October. And honestly, that sounds like heaven right now. She glanced at him. "You work the line?" "A long time," he said. "Then you'd know. Is it a good place? To work, I mean. People talk about the family like their weather." She pulled the folder out of her bag and started, helplessly, to straighten the pages inside it, tapping them square against her knee. "I've heard the old man who built it was a tyrant. I've heard the son's worse. Cold. Counts the silver himself, that sort of thing. Never says good morning." She caught herself. Sorry, you probably love them. I'd love them too if they signed my checks. Forget I said anything. The man looked out at the water. The corner of his mouth did something that wasn't quite a movement. I won't tell him, he said. You'd better not. I need this. She said it lightly, but it came out with a thread of something underneath that she hadn't meant to let show, and she covered it the way she always did, by standing up and doing something. Is there coffee on this thing, or is that a captain's only situation? He stood, unhurried, set his own cup on the bench, and went into the little galley nook beside the wheelhouse without a word. She heard a tap run, a pot clatter. He came back with a chipped enamel mug and held it out to her. And she took it, and she drank, and she made a face before she could stop herself. Oh, she said. Oh, that's terrible. It is, he agreed. That is genuinely the worst coffee I have ever had in my mouth, and I have worked in 3 diners. She drank more of it anyway, wrapping both hands around the warmth. You'll never make foreman with coffee like this, Captain. I'm telling you that for your own good. He sat back down across from her, and for a second, the stillness in him cracked, just slightly, the way ice does before it gives. Not a smile, but the place a smile would have started if he remembered how. I'll keep it in mind, he said. The crossing took 40 minutes. She spent most of it talking, because talking was what she did when she was frightened. And she was very frightened, though she would not have said so to a stranger on a boat. She told him about the diner that closed, and the apartment she was 3 weeks behind on, and the way the listing for this job had felt like the last lit window on a dark street. She did not tell him about her mother. She never told anyone about her mother. But she told him almost everything else, and he said perhaps 40 words back the entire way. And somehow, those 40 words made her feel listened to in a way that an hour of someone else's chatter never had. He asked her name once. She told him. He didn't offer his, and she was talking too fast to notice she hadn't asked. Later she would lie awake, taking that omission apart, turning it the way he turned his cup. But on the boat, it slid past her unmarked, the way a current slides under a hull. He had a way of going quiet that felt like room being made rather than a door being shut, and she filled the room the way she always did, with everything except the one thing that mattered. The engine hummed up through the soles of her shoes. The far shore smudged green, and then sharpened, and she mistook the steadiness in him for the steadiness of a man with nothing to lose, when it was the steadiness of a man with everything to. When the island came up out of the haze, green and high-shouldered, a white house riding the crown of it like something out of a painting she couldn't afford, she stopped mid-sentence and just looked. That's it? She said. That's where I'm going to iron tablecloths? That's it, he said. The launch came in along a stone jetty where the water went suddenly clear and cold-looking, and a boy of about 19 in a sun-faded polo was waiting with a coil of line over his shoulder, grinning at the boat like it had personally brought him a present. "Morning, Cap," the boy called, and threw a loop over the bollard with the showy ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. "Quiet crossing?" The man, the captain, Nora decided, since the boy had just confirmed it, stepped up onto the gunwale and off onto the stone in one motion. "Quiet enough," he said. And that was when the other one arrived, a tall man in a suit too good for a jetty, sunglasses pushed up into pale hair, a leather folder under his arm, and impatience coming off him in waves. He came straight down the jetty without looking at the boy or the boat, and he stopped in front of the captain and said, "Thorn. Good. The board wants an answer by Friday, and I'm not leaving this rock without one." The jetty stone was warm already through her thin soles, salt-bleached and pocked, and the water against it was so clear she could see the green weave of weed 2 fathoms down. A gull screamed somewhere overhead. She got a knee up onto the stone and shoved, and her bag came after, and the whole exchange behind her reached her in pieces over the slap of the water. Nora was 12 feet away, wrestling her bag up onto the jetty, and she caught the word, Thorn. And she did what a tired brain does with a hard word it half hears. She filed it. Somebody named Thorn. The owner. The man in the suit must be here to see the owner. She glanced up the green hill toward the White House where the owner presumably was, counting his silver. And she did not connect the name to the quiet man with the terrible coffee, because why on earth would she? The captain said something low to the suit that she didn't catch. The suit's jaw tightened. He looked, for the first time, at Nora, a flick of assessment, dismissal, gone. And then he walked back up the jetty talking into a phone. The boy in the polo had appeared at her elbow. "You're the 9 o'clock," he said. "The house interview. You came over on the Mara-T?" He looked delighted and slightly scandalized. "Nobody comes over on the—" "Theo." The captain said it quietly, and the boy shut his mouth around the rest of the sentence so fast Nora heard his teeth click. "Right," Theo said. "Right. This way, miss. Mrs. Cross is expecting you, and Mrs. Cross does not like to be kept, so if you could walk fast and look like you slept, that'd be— Yeah, like that. Good." Nora glanced back once as she followed the boy up the path. The captain was standing on the jetty with his coffee that he'd somehow reclaimed, watching the launch settle against the stone, alone, in the particular way of a man who was always, even in a crowd, a little apart. She lifted the chipped enamel mug she was still, she realized, holding. "I'll bring this back," she called. "And we're going to talk about the coffee, Captain. It's a public safety issue." He raised one hand, not a wave, an acknowledgement. And she turned and went up the hill to meet the woman who would decide whether she got to keep eating. And she did not think about him again for almost 2 hours, which was the longest she would manage for the rest of the summer. Renmore House did not so much sit on the island as preside over it. Up close, it was bigger than the painting had promised, and colder, all pale stone and tall windows, and a gravel court raked into lines so straight they looked drawn. Theo delivered her to a side door. "Family uses the front. Staff uses the sea door. You'll learn the geography." And into a corridor that smelled of beeswax and old roses. And then into the presence of Mrs. Vivian Cross, who was waiting in a small bright office with her hands folded on a clean desk and an expression that had been ironed flatter than any tablecloth Nora would ever touch. "Miss Quinn." Mrs. Cross did not stand. She was perhaps 55, silver-haired, in a grey so precise it could have been a uniform, and she looked at Nora's curling folder and travel-creased blouse and the chipped staff mug in her hand for exactly as long as it took to form a complete opinion. "You're late." "The connection from the mainland was tight," Nora said. "I made the crossing. I'm here and I'm ready, and I promise the version of me you're looking at is the worst version you'll get all summer." A silence. Mrs. Cross's eyes went briefly to the mug. Something flickered there. Surprise, quickly put away. "Sit," she said. Nora sat. She set the mug carefully on the very edge of the desk, squared her folder on her knee, and began the fight for her life. The office smelled of lemon polish, and the cold mineral breath of a room kept just shy of warm, and the desk between them held nothing, not a paper out of place, not a pen at a careless angle, which told her more about Vivian Cross than any answer would. Nora knew rooms like this. She knew the women who built them. You did not soften them with charm. You softened them, if at all, by being unmistakably good at the work, and you let them watch you not flinch. So she folded her own hands to keep them from straightening the folder again, and she met the flat grey gaze. And she did not flinch. It went better than she had any right to expect, and worse than she'd hoped. Mrs. Cross asked about covers and counts, and how Nora would handle a dinner for 40 when the fish arrived spoiled at 4 o'clock. And Nora, who had lived that exact afternoon more than once, answered in the brisk shorthand of someone who had actually done the work and not just read about it. And she watched the older woman's flat expression shift by tiny degrees towards something that was not warmth, but was at least attention. The post is live-in through the season, Mrs. Cross said. 6 days. The house keeps a particular standard. The family values discretion above almost everything, and the man who owns this island, and here her voice did something formal and final, the way some people said the name of a church, does not tolerate familiarity from staff. You will find him private. You will not find him cruel, whatever the mainland says. You will most likely not find him at all. He keeps to himself. Is that understood? Understood, Nora said. You'll be on probation for 1 week. If at the staff welcome dinner on Saturday I have not had cause to send you back, you'll stay. Mrs. Cross stood, which meant the interview was over. We dress for that dinner. The home house sits down together once a season, family and staff, and standards are observed. Do you have anything suitable? I'll make something suitable, Nora said, which was not the same as yes, and they both knew it. And Mrs. Cross, for reasons she did not examine, let it pass. At the door, Nora stopped. The captain, she said. The one who runs the launch, the Mara tea. I owe him a mug and an apology for what I said about his coffee. Where would I find him? Something happened in the older woman's face then. A hairline shift, gone almost before it arrived, the way a single cloud crosses a window, and the light changes, and you can't say after whether you saw it. Nora, who made her living reading the weather of other people's faces, filed it away with the half-heard name on the jetty. 2 small, wrong notes she didn't yet have the music to place. The smallest pause. You'll find him about the place, Mrs. Cross said, after a moment that Nora was too tired to read. He's about the place a great deal. Mind your work first. Nora found him about the place that very evening. She had been given a narrow, clean room under the eaves, with a window full of sea, and she had unpacked her 2 bags in 4 minutes, and then she had been unable to sit still in it. Sitting still had never once solved a problem she had. So she'd gone down to return the mug. The kitchen pointed her to the boathouse. The boathouse was a long, low building down at the jetty, with its big doors open to the evening, gold light pouring in off the water and pooling on a stone floor. And inside it, the captain was on his back under the engine cowling of the Mara tea, with a wrench and an expression of patient war. She stopped in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. The boathouse breathed out at her. Engine oil and old rope, and the green underwater smell of a place the tide came into. All of it warmed by the low gold flooding off the water. Tools hung on the wall, in a discipline that matched Mrs. Cross's empty desk. Every wrench in its outline. It was the cleanest disorder she'd ever seen. The workshop of a man who had nothing to do with his hands, and did it anyway. And she understood, without being able to say how, that she'd walked into the one room on this whole island where somebody was allowed to be himself. She just had the himself wrong. I brought your mug back, she said from the doorway. And I've been thinking about your coffee all day, which is not the kind of impression a man wants to make on a stranger. So I'm going to teach you to fix it. It's the least I can do. You may have saved my life this morning. He slid out from under the cowling and sat up, wiping his hands on a rag, and the gold light did something to him that the marina hadn't. Took 10 years, and most of the stillness off him. Left something younger and more uncertain underneath. I didn't do anything, he said. You let me on the boat, and you didn't laugh at me, and you gave me coffee, even though it was a crime. She came in, set the mug on the bench, and looked around the boathouse with frank curiosity. The tools racked just so, the spare lines coiled like sleeping snakes. A single photograph tucked into the frame of the window. A woman's face, faded. This is yours, the whole boat operation. I look after the boats, he said, which was true. He turned the wrench over in his hands. You got the job. 1 week of it, probation. She picked up a length of line, found her fingers wanted something to do, started coiling it the way her hands remembered from a summer working docks before the diners. If I survive the welcome dinner Saturday, I stay till October. Mrs. Cross terrifies me in a way I deeply respect. And apparently I'll never even meet the owner, which is fine, since I already told you exactly what I think of him, and I'd hate to have to lie to his face." She glanced over. "You won't really tell him?" He watched her hands move on the line. "No," he said. "I won't tell him." "Good." She finished the coil, hung it on the peg where its brothers lived, and brushed her palms together. "Right. So, the coffee. Tomorrow, before the crossing, I'm going to show you the single most important thing about coffee, which is that you have to actually clean the pot, you animal. Deal?" There was that crack in the stillness again. The place, a smile started. "Deal," he said. She left him in the gold light with his engine and his faded photograph, and as she climbed the path, she glanced back once through the open boathouse doors. He had not gone back to the engine. He was sitting on the bench, with something small and bright turning over and over in his fingers, his head bent, the water throwing gold up onto the rafters above him. And he looked, she thought, like a man listening to something that had stopped playing. Then the path turned, and the doorway slid out of sight, and she went up to her narrow room and slept the whole night through, for the first time in a month. She slept that first night with the window cracked to the sound of the sea working at the foot of the island, and she woke before she meant to with salt on her lips and the strange light feeling of having, for once, somewhere to be. The relief frightened her a little. She had learned not to let a place feel like safety too soon, because the places that felt like safety were exactly the ones that cost the most to lose. The first week of any job, Nora knew, was a held breath. You learned the geography and the politics and where the bodies were buried, and you did not, under any circumstances, sit down. She did not sit down. She was up before the girls, ironing the long sea-blue cloths for the terrace lunches the family apparently never attended, learning which of the 40 rooms got aired and which stayed shut, memorizing Mrs. Cross's standards the way she'd once memorized a Saturday night ticket rail. Fast, complete, no second asking. By Tuesday, she could lay a table for 12 in under 9 minutes. By Wednesday, the kitchen had stopped watching her hands, and every morning, before the 8:15 crossing, she went down to the boathouse and taught the captain to make coffee. The path down to the water was steep and dew-soaked at that hour, the grass wetting her ankles, the air thin and grey and smelling of cold stone before the sun got into it. She told herself she went because the coffee was a public menace and somebody had to. That was true, and it was also the kind of true she used to cover the other true, which was that the boathouse at 5 in the morning had become the 1 hour of her own day that nobody had bought. It became the shape of her days, the thing the rest hung from. She would come down with the light still grey on the water, and he would already be there, doing something competent and quiet to a piece of machinery. And she would take the pot away from him and clean it. Actually clean it, scouring out the burnt ghost of 1,000 crossings, and show him the grind, the water just off the boil, the weight. He learned the way he seemed to do everything, which was completely and without comment. And on Thursday, he handed her a cup that was, against all odds, good. "There," she said, genuinely moved. "There it is. You're a changed man, Captain. I want you to know I'm proud of you, and that I take full credit." "It's your pot," he said. "It's our pot." She drank, leaning against the bench, watching the harbour wake up. Theo was down on the jetty already, hosing salt off the stone, singing something tuneless. Up the hill, the white house caught the early light. "Can I ask you something, and you don't have to answer? Why are you down here every morning at 5? Nobody's making you. There's no crossing for hours." He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "It's the only part of the day that's mine," he said. She didn't make a joke of it. She heard the weight under the plain words. She was good at that, at the thing under the thing, and she let it sit between them. And after a moment, she just refilled his cup, which was its own kind of answer, and he seemed to understand it as one. She watched him work while the harbour woke, and she let herself, for once, simply be somewhere. The scour of the pot under her hands, the smell of fresh grounds cutting the diesel, the steam curling up into the grey. These were the textures of a morning that asked nothing of her, and she didn't trust them, and she came back to them anyway. That, she thought, was the dangerous part. Not that the island was beautiful, that it was beginning to feel like hers. She formed, over that week, a whole theory of him. He was the long-time captain of the line, she decided, the man who'd grown up on these boats, who knew the water better than the family did, who'd watched the old tyrant die and the cold sun inherit, and stayed because the sea was the sea, and a job was a job. She decided he was lonely. She decided the family used him and undervalued him, the way places like this always undervalued the people who actually kept them running. She built him a life out of glances, and it was wrong in every particular except the loneliness, which she had read exactly right, and which was the only part she never said aloud. What she did say aloud, freely, daily, to his face, was everything she thought about the man who owned the place. "I still haven't met him, you know," she told him on Friday, perched on an upturned crate eating half her lunch. She always brought 2 halves and gave him one, a thing that had started as repaying the coffee and become simply how lunch worked. 6 days, not a glimpse. Mrs. Cross says he keeps to himself, which I'm starting to think is staff code for hides. What's he even like? You must know him. Is he as bad as they say? The captain looked at the sandwich in his hands. "He's worse company than the stories," he said, "and better than they think. It's a hard thing to be both." "That's very diplomatic. That's a non-answer and you know it." She pointed at him with a crust. "I think you're protecting him. I think you're loyal, which says something nice about you, and something suspicious about him. A man who inspires loyalty in good people and terror in the mainland. I don't trust it." She chewed, thinking. "But I'll tell you what I do think. I think a man who owns an island and a ferry line and a house with 40 rooms and can't be bothered to come down and say good morning to the people scrubbing his floors is a coward. Rich and a coward. The worst combination. You can quote me." The stillness came down over him like a shade pulled in a window. He set the sandwich down. For a second she thought she'd genuinely offended him, and she opened her mouth to take it back, and then he said, very quietly, "Maybe he doesn't know how. To come down and say it. Maybe he's forgotten that you can just say good morning to a person, and have it be nothing, and not have them want something back." Nora stopped chewing. It was the most words she'd heard him string together in 6 days, and they had come out with a rawness that didn't match a man defending his employer. They matched a man defending himself. But she didn't have the frame to see it yet. She was looking at the captain, the lonely captain she'd invented. So she did what kindness told her to do, which was reach across and bump her shoulder against his. "Then he should learn," she said gently. "It's not hard. Watch." "Good morning, Captain." A long beat, the water slapping the hull, the gulls. "Good morning," he said. And the way he said it, like a man saying a word in a language he used to speak, made something turn over in her chest that she decided firmly not to examine. She examined it anyway, all the way up the hill, with the sun finally over the water and warm on the back of her neck. It was nothing, she told herself. It was a kind word to a lonely man, the cheapest thing she had to give, the one currency she was sure of. If she felt it land in her own chest as well, that was just the morning, just the light, just the rare animal comfort of being near someone who didn't seem to want a single thing from her. She had been wrong about the wanting for a week now. She had no idea yet how completely. The friction came on the Friday, the way friction always came, from a direction she wasn't watching. The man in the suit was back. Pine, she'd learned from the resort group, here 3 days out of every 5 now, walking the grounds with a tablet and the proprietary air of a man pricing a thing he intended to buy. She'd worked out that much of the secondary weather of the house, the family was thinking of selling. The island, the line, all of it, to a company that would put a spa where the boathouse was. The staff talked about it in the low, worried way of people who could see their winter coming early. Nobody knew which way the owner would jump. Nobody had asked him. You didn't ask him things. Pine found her on the terrace polishing glassware for a lunch that, as usual, no one would eat. He looked at her the way the suit had looked at her on the jetty. A flick, a filing, a dismissal. And then he held out an empty coffee cup without breaking his phone conversation, not even glancing at her, the universal gesture of a man who had decided what she was for. The glassware was warm from the sun and squeaked under her cloth, and the terrace stone threw heat up at her bare arms, and somewhere below the wild roses by the boathouse let go a thread of scent on the breeze. She'd been having a perfectly good morning. She watched the empty cup hang there in the air between them, an inch from her face, and she felt the old fork in the road open under her feet, the one her mother had walked the safe way down 1,000 times, folding linens at midnight so the family would keep her. She could have taken it. A week into a job she could not afford to lose, with a probation dinner the next night. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to take the cup and say, of course, and refill it. She took the cup. But something in her, the part her mother had warned her about, the part that had never once let her be smaller than she was even when smaller was safer, made her set it down on the tray with a click, square the tray, and say pleasantly, "The coffee's in the morning room, sir. Help yourself. I'm staff, not service. There's a difference, though I understand it's a subtle one." Pine lowered the phone, looked at her properly for the first time. "Do you know who I'm here to see?" "I genuinely don't," Nora said. "And with respect, you don't know who I am either, and we're both surviving it." His face started to do something unpleasant, and then a shadow fell across the terrace table, and the captain was there. She hadn't heard him come up from the jetty. He moved like weather, standing at a polite distance with a coil of line over his shoulder and his eyes on Pine, and the temperature on the terrace dropped 10 degrees, in a way Nora felt but did not understand. "Mr. Pine," the captain said, "the launch is ready when you are. Friday boat's at 4. You won't want to miss it." A pause that was not really a pause. "We don't hold it." Pine looked at the captain, and something passed over his face that Nora couldn't read. Wariness, recalculation. The look of a man who has just remembered something he briefly forgot. "No," he said. "No, of course." He pocketed the phone. He did not take the coffee cup. He walked off the terrace toward the house, and the captain watched him go the whole way, still as a post. And only when the door had shut did the stillness go out of him. "You didn't have to do that," Nora said. "I had him." "You did," the captain agreed. "I know you did." He shifted the line on his shoulder. He looked for a moment, almost embarrassed. "I didn't like the way he held the cup," he said. And it was such a strange, plain, human thing to say that Nora laughed out loud, and the last of the tension broke and ran out of her. And she didn't notice that he hadn't smiled, that he was looking at her laughing, the way a man looks at a fire he's not allowed to stand near. She didn't let herself wonder, in that moment, why a man who looked after the boats could lower the temperature of a terrace simply by standing on it. She filed that away too, with the rest of the small wrong notes, in the growing folder of things about the captain that didn't quite add up, and that she kept not adding up, because the sum frightened her, and the not adding was so much warmer. "My hero," she said, hand on her heart, teasing. "The captain rides in. Where's your horse?" "In the boathouse," he said. "Needs an oil change." And it was so dry, so unexpected, so exactly the rhythm of the thing she'd have said herself, that she stopped laughing and stared at him. Was that a joke? She demanded. Captain, did you make a joke? No, he said. You did. That was a joke. I've been here 6 days, and you've been a sphinx, and you just made a joke. She was delighted out of all proportion, and she didn't know why it felt like a small door opening, but it did. I'm writing this down. Day 6. The captain has a sense of humor. Mrs. Cross will want it for the records. Don't tell Mrs. Cross, he said. She'll dock my pay. And that was 2 in a row, and Nora laughed until she had to wipe her eyes. And when she opened them and looked up, for no reason, the way you glance toward a window, she caught Mrs. Cross standing at the tall glass of the morning room, motionless, watching them both. The older woman's ironed expression was, for once, not flat at all. It was something Nora couldn't name from that distance, but it was not approval, and it had the shape of a verdict already reached. Then Mrs. Cross turned from the glass and was gone, and the captain followed Nora's glance up at the empty window and went very still, and the easy thing that had been on the terrace folded itself quietly away. She saw the other side of Mrs. Cross by accident, the way you only ever see the true thing. It was Saturday morning, the day of the welcome dinner, and Nora had been sent up into the family wing with an armful of pressed linen for the guest rooms. Staff didn't go into the family wing ordinarily, but the house was full for the season opening, and the rules bent. The corridor up there was hushed and dim, the carpet swallowing her steps, the doors all shut. All but one. The last door stood half open on a study she had no business looking into, and she would have walked past it, except that there was a sound coming from inside that stopped her. Not a word, just a breath. The particular catch of a breath that someone is trying to keep quiet. Mrs. Cross was standing at the desk with her back to the door. On the desk was a brass nameplate, the kind that sits at the front of a desk, and she had it in both hands and a soft cloth, and she was polishing it with a slowness that had nothing to do with cleaning. Nora could just read it from the doorway. Augustus Thorne. The old man. The tyrant who'd built the place and died and left it to his cold son. And Vivian Cross, who showed nothing, who was made of grey precision, stood there in the early light, running her thumb over the dead man's name with her face undone. And once, just once, she lifted the nameplate and pressed it briefly to her chest, the way you hold a thing, or a person, you are not allowed to say out loud that you miss. The corridor air up here was different, close and still, and scented with cedar and the dry sweetness of old paper, a part of the house that breathed slower than the rest. Nora stood with the warm stack of linen against her chest, and the pressed cotton smell of it rising under her chin, and she felt herself become a trespasser, not on a room, but on a grief, and the wrongness of that prickled up the backs of her arms. Nora stepped back from the door. She did it without deciding to, the way you step back from a fire that flares. She walked very quietly to the guest room, laid down the linen, and went back the long way, the way that didn't pass the study, and she never said a word about it to anyone, then or after. But something in her rearranged. The flat, terrible woman who held Nora's whole summer in one ironed hand was not flat at all. She was holding something, the way Nora was always holding something. She just held it where no one could see. It did not make the confrontation, when it came, any easier. It came an hour later, in Mrs. Cross's bright office, and it was not about linen. "Sit down, Miss Quinn." Nora sat. Mrs. Cross did not. She stood at the window with her hands folded, the same window she'd watched the terrace from, and she did not turn around at first. "You've done the week's work well. Better than well. The kitchen likes you, which the kitchen does not do. By the standard I hired you to meet, you have met it, and at tonight's dinner I would, in the ordinary way of things, confirm your post for the season." "I hear an and," Nora said. "And?" Mrs. Cross turned. Her face had gone back to grey. The morning's grief filed away so completely that Nora might have dreamed it. "Let me be clear, because I am only going to say this once, and I am going to say it to your benefit, whatever you decide to believe. You have become familiar with a member of this household in a way that will not end well for you. I have watched it all week. I watched it on the terrace yesterday. You think you are being kind to a lonely man who works the boats. You are not in possession of the facts, and the facts, when you come into them, are going to hurt you. And they are going to hurt you in front of people. Because that is how this house arranges its cruelties. In front of people, at dinners, with the silver out." Outside the window, the sea lay flat and innocent and very blue, and a single sail crawled across it, and the bright, ordinary morning made the words in the room sound stranger than they were. Nora's mouth had gone dry. She heard, under the warning, the shape of something the older woman wasn't saying. A withheld fact with weight to it, a stone held just out of sight, and every instinct she had for reading a room told her it was true, and told her she did not want it to be. The cold went down Nora's spine before she understood it, the way cold does. "I don't know what you mean. The captain's a friend. I'm allowed a friend." "He is not the captain." Mrs. Cross said it flatly, and then she stopped herself, visibly, a woman reaching the edge of a thing she had decided not to be the one to say. "I will not do it for him. It is not mine to do. But I am telling you to be careful, and I am telling you that whatever you imagine is happening on that jetty in the mornings, the person it will cost is you. Men in his position do not pay for these things. They are not made to. Women like us pay for them. I have watched it cost a great deal once, a long time ago, and I will not watch it again on my own staff without at least having said, 'Stop,' before tonight. For your own sake, Miss Quinn, stop." Nora stood up. Her hands wanted a task, and there was no task, so she pressed them flat against her thighs and made them be still. And she looked at the woman she had watched grieve a dead man into a nameplate an hour ago, and she found, underneath her fear, the steady, plain thing that had always been the truest part of her. "I don't know what the facts are," she said. "You won't tell me, and he won't tell me, and that's the two of you's business, not mine. But I know what I see. I see a man who's down at the boats at 5 in the morning because it's the only part of the day that's his. I see somebody who's been spoken to like a checkbook so long he flinched when I just said good morning. I haven't taken one thing from him, Mrs. Cross. I split my sandwich with him. I taught him to wash a coffee pot. If that's the kind of familiarity that ends a person in this house, then your house is worse than the mainland says, and I'd rather pay for the sandwich than keep a post that costs me being kind to a lonely person." She drew a breath. "I'll dress for dinner. I'll observe your standards. But I won't stop saying good morning to somebody who needs to hear it. Send me back if you have to." For a long moment, Mrs. Cross said nothing at all. Something moved across her ironed face. Anger, Nora thought, and braced for it, and then realized, too late to make sense of it, that it was not anger. It was something closer to grief, and closer than that to recognition, as though Nora had just said aloud a sentence Mrs. Cross had carried unspoken for 30 years. "Then you'd better dress well," Mrs. Cross said finally, and turned back to the window. "That's all, Miss Quinn." Nora left. She did not see, could not have seen, that she had won something, because it did not feel like winning. It felt like walking toward a door in the dark with her hands out. But she had said the true thing, and the true thing, in her experience, had to be paid for somewhere. She just didn't know yet what the bill would say, or whose name would be at the bottom of it, or that it was already, even then, coming due with the weather. The weather came in at 2 o'clock, and it came in wrong. It was meant to be a summer evening, the season's first proper warm Saturday, the kind the welcome dinner was built around, long gold light on the terrace, and the doors thrown open to the water. The forecast had promised it all week. But at 2, the light went strange and brassy, and the gulls came inland, low and quiet, and Nora, hauling chairs out to the terrace, felt the air change against her arms the way it used to change over the harbor before a blow, and she stopped with a chair in each hand and looked at the horizon, where a wall of slate was standing up out of the sea and walking toward them. The air had changed against her skin first, before her eyes caught up, that prickling drop in pressure she knew from the harbor of her childhood, the way a coming blow announced itself in the small bones of the wrist. The light over the water had gone the color of a bruise under brass. The roses by the boathouse had stopped giving up their scent. Even the gulls had quit their noise. The whole island had pulled itself in and gone watchful, and the smell that came off the sea now was not the clean morning salt, but something colder and metallic, the smell of weather with intent. "That's not a shower," she said to Theo, who'd come to help and was looking at the same wall with the sailor's frank respect. "That's a squall line," Theo said. "Early. Nobody called that." His grin had gone. The provisions boats still on the mainland. Flowers, the hired waiters, half the dinner. It was all coming on the 4 o'clock charter. He pulled out his phone, listened, swore in a way that would have cost him pay if Mrs. Cross had heard. "Charter's cancelled. Coast Guard's closing the channel in an hour. Nothing's crossing till morning." He looked up at her, 19 and suddenly out of his depth. "Mrs. Cross is going to lose it. The whole dinner's on that boat. The family's seated at 8. There's 40 covers and we've got... what's even in the house?" And here, at last, was the afternoon Nora Quinn had been training for her entire working life. She set the chairs down. She felt the old calm come over her, the cold, clean calm of service in the weeds, the thing that had carried her through 100 Saturday nights when the fish came spoiled and the line cook quit and the dining room filled up anyway. Her hands stopped wanting a task, because suddenly there were 40 of them. "Okay," she said. "Okay, right. So," she turned to Theo. "First, nobody loses it. Panic is a thing we don't have time for. Go find Marisol in the kitchen and ask her what's actually in the cold store in the garden. Everything, not just what's on the menu. Then find me. Where's Mrs. Cross?" "Trying to reach the charter company and getting nowhere." "Then she's busy. Good. Go." She moved. She went into the kitchen, where Marisol the cook was standing over a menu card, looking like a woman watching her own funeral. And Nora took the card gently out of her hands and said, "We're not making this. We're making something better, and we're making it from what's here. And at 8 o'clock, the family is going to sit down to a dinner that looks like we planned it this way on purpose. Show me the cold store." It was the kind of thing that should not have worked. There were 2 hours. There were no flowers and no hired hands and no provisions, and a storm coming through the windows. But the island, it turned out, was rich in exactly the ways that mattered when the boat stopped. There was a kitchen garden gone joyful with early summer. There were eggs and good butter and a wheel of cheese and yesterday's bread that wanted only to be something else. There was a whole cold store of the island's own. And there was Nora, who could look at a garden and a half-empty larder and see a menu the way other people saw a sentence. The cold store breathed out at her when Marisol hauled the door, a wall of chill, smelling of cheese rind and earth-damp root vegetables and the iron tang of the stone walls, and Nora stood in it for a moment, letting the whole inventory arrange itself behind her eyes the way a ticket rail used to. Eggs. Butter the color of butter ought to be. A wheel of something sharp under wax. Yesterday's bread gone just stale enough to want a second life. Outside, the first fat drops were starting to smack the windows, and her heart was going hard. And underneath the fear ran the old, clean thread of joy she'd never been able to explain to anyone. There was nothing in the world she loved like a disaster she could feed. She built it in her head in 90 seconds. And then she built it for real, with her hands and everyone else's. She put Theo on the garden with a basket and a list. She put Marisol on the thing Marisol did best, and took the rest herself. She sent 2 housemaids out to cut greenery and branches of the wild white roses that grew down by the boathouse. No flowers means we use the island. It'll look like we meant it, because we will mean it. And she laid the long table with sea blue cloths and island roses in water glasses, and candle after candle after candle, because the power, she'd already guessed, was not going to last the night. And a room full of candlelight in a storm doesn't look like a disaster. It looks like the most romantic thing anyone has ever seen. For an hour, the kitchen was a single working animal, and she was its heart, and she had never felt more like herself. The roses came in, dripping and thorn-scratched, and were stripped and crowded into water glasses. Greenery went down the cloth in a dark river. The candles multiplied along the table, until the whole room waited gold and trembling for people who didn't know yet how close they'd come to nothing. Rain ran in sheets down the black glass. Her hands smelled of cut stems and tallow and wood smoke, and her blouse had gone through at the back, and she was, she realized, somewhere in the middle of it, completely happy. She did not notice, until she turned to send someone for more candles, that the captain was standing in the kitchen doorway. He had been there, she understood, for some time. He was wet to the shoulders from helping Theo drag the launch up and double its lines against the coming blow, and he was watching her run a 40-cover dinner out of nothing in the middle of a storm. And the look on his face was not the still, careful nothing he wore for the world. It was wide open. It was the look of a man who has just watched someone do, easily and without being asked, the one thing he had given up believing anyone would ever do for this house. Save it. Not because they were paid to, not because they wanted something, but because it needed saving, and they were the kind of person who saved things. "What?" Nora said, wiping her hands, a little breathless, a lot alive. "Don't stand in my doorway looking tragic, Captain. Grab a candle, make yourself useful. You want to help? Light those, all of them. Every candle in this house. I don't care if they're the family's good ones, especially the family's good ones." He didn't move for a second. Then he said quietly, "You're going to save it. The whole dinner. By yourself." "Not by myself. By everybody. That's the trick. There's no by yourself in a kitchen." She pushed a box of candles into his chest. "Now light. And then, when this is plated and the family sat down and it's somebody else's problem for 20 minutes, I want you to meet me at the boathouse, because I am going to need to stand somewhere that isn't on fire, and you're the only person here who doesn't want anything from me, and right now, that's the most restful thing I can think of." She paused, struck by her own words, and softened. "Is that all right? To ask you that?" The candles were between them, and his hands had come up around the box over hers, and he had gone very still again. But it was a different stillness now. Not the shade pulled down, but the held breath of a man standing at the edge of saying a true and dangerous thing. His mouth opened. She watched him decide to tell her something. She watched it arrive in him. And then the power went out. The whole house dropped into dusk at once, the storm hammering the windows, and from somewhere in the dark, Mrs. Cross's voice rose, sharp and carrying. "Lights! Miss Quinn, the candles, now, before the family comes down." And the moment broke, and whatever the captain had been about to say went back down inside him unspoken, and he struck a match instead, and the small flame lit his face from below and made him, for 1 second, look unbearably young and unbearably sad. "Boathouse," Nora said softly, taking a candle from his hand. "After. Don't forget." "I won't," he said. And he began, in the roaring dark, to light the family's good candles one by one, and she ran to do the same. And neither of them knew that they had just used up the last easy hour either of them would have for a long time. She made the boathouse by 7:30, with 20 minutes she'd stolen from the seam between disaster and dinner. Everything was ready. The long table glowed gold against the storm in the windows. The island roses leaning out of their water glasses, the rescued dinner waiting under cloths in a kitchen lit like a chapel. The family would come down at 8. For 20 minutes, the thing was built and not yet begun. And Nora had walked out into the rain and down the path with a candle cupped in her hand to the one place on the island that had never asked anything of her. He was there. Of course he was there. He had a storm lantern lit and hung from a beam, and the big doors were pulled to against the weather, and the Mara T rode high and safe on her doubled lines in the dark water, and the whole long room was warm with that low gold light and the smell of rope and salt and rain. He'd changed out of the wet jacket. He looked, in the lantern light, like the answer to a question she hadn't let herself ask. "I have 20 minutes, she announced, coming in out of the rain, shaking the wet off. "And I have decided to spend all of them sitting on a crate and not solving anything. And I'm warning you now I might fall asleep mid-sentence, and if I do, you are to leave me here and tell Mrs. Cross I died bravely." The rain drummed on the boathouse roof in a steady roar that walled the two of them off from everything. And inside it, the lantern threw a small, warm country of gold across the worn boards. It smelled of rope and tar, and the rain coming in clean off the sea, and the Mara T creaked and settled on her doubled lines like a horse easing in a stall. Nora stood dripping in the doorway, and felt the whole shaking day drain out through the soles of her feet. And the thing that scared her wasn't the storm. It was how badly she'd wanted to come here. How fast, in 1 week, this low gold room had become the place she ran toward when everything else was on fire. "Sit," he said, and she sat, and he handed her a cup, and she drank, and it was coffee. Good coffee. The coffee she'd taught him, made right. Made for her. And something about that, after the afternoon she'd had, but a lump in her throat she had to drink around. "You made it right," she said. "You taught me." He sat on the bench across from her, the old place, the lunch place, and the storm threw itself at the doors and could not get in. 12 years I've been on this water," he said, after a while, turning the cup in his hands. 12 years. And the coffee never once improved. And then you got on the wrong boat. The corner of his mouth moved. The foreman's prospects are looking up. She laughed, tired and full. "Are you ever going to make foreman, Captain? Honestly, at your age?" "I keep being told my coffee held me back." "It did. It held you back terribly. But you've reformed." She tipped her head against a post and looked at him through the gold light, and for a moment, neither of them said anything clever, and the not saving anything she'd promised herself turned into something quieter and more dangerous. "Can I tell you something true?" she said, "and you don't laugh?" "I never laugh," he said. "I've been told I don't know how." "You're getting better at that, too." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "I've been broke and scared for 2 years. For a while. And I learned to be the person who fixes it, whatever it is. Because if I'm fixing it, then I'm worth keeping around, and if I stop—" She stopped, squared the cup against her knee, an old nervous habit, and made herself go on, because the storm and the lantern and the man who never wanted anything had made it briefly possible. "And tonight, I fixed an impossible dinner, and it was the best I've felt in 2 years. And I just realized, sitting here, that the best part wasn't the fixing. It was telling you I'd meet you after. It was knowing there was an after, and that you'd be in it." She shook her head. "That's not a thing you say to a man you've known a week. Forget it. It's the storm talking." He had gone very still. Not the shade-pulled stillness, the other one, the held breath at the edge of the dangerous true thing. The lantern swung a little and moved the light across his face. "Next season," he said, and stopped. And she watched him hear himself say it. Next season. A future. a whole future spoken plain in a boathouse in a storm, and watched it frighten him and not stop him. Next season the crossings get bad in September. The Maratee takes the swell better than the big boat. If you stayed past October. The garden's better in spring than it is now. You should see it in spring. He was not looking at her. He was looking at his hands. I'm doing this badly. You're doing it perfectly, she said, and she was barely breathing. There's something I have to tell you. He set the cup down. He looked up, and the whole of him was in his face, undefended, terrified. And she had never in her life wanted so badly to cross a small distance. Before tonight, before you go up there, I should have told you on the first morning, on the boat. And I didn't, because you talked to me like... And I couldn't. And every day after it got harder. And now it's tonight, and I'm out of mornings. Nora, my name isn't... The boathouse door banged open on the wind, and Theo half fell through it, rain sheeting off him, white-faced and gasping. Cap, Nora, you have to come up, both of you, now! He hauled a breath. The family's down early, the whole table's sat. Mrs. Cross sent me running. She says, Nora, she says you're to be at the dinner, seated, not serving, on Mr. Thorne's... She said the head of the table. She said, come, now! He looked between them, catching, even at 19, that he'd walked into the middle of something with a hammer. Sorry, but she said, now. Nora was already up, already moving, the service reflex faster than thought. The table sat, the dinner she'd built going out, her place in it. Go, she told the captain, breathless, half laughing with the adrenaline of it. Tell me after, whatever it is. It'll keep 20 minutes, won't it? Come up, sit with me. I saved you a... Actually, I don't know where they've put anyone, but find me. And she was through the door into the rain before he could answer, running up the path toward the lit house, with her heart going for a dozen reasons. Behind her, she heard him call her name once. Just her name. Nora. Torn off by the wind. With something in it she would spend the rest of the night trying to forget she'd heard. Not a goodbye, exactly, but the sound a person makes reaching for something already out of the door. She didn't stop. She couldn't have said why she should. She ran up the hill to the lit house and her saved dinner and her place at the table, one beat ahead of a man who could not get up the path fast enough to reach her first. The dining room she had built out of nothing stopped her in the doorway because it was beautiful, and because every face in it was turned toward her. The candles had done what she'd known they would. The long table ran gold and shadowed down the center of the room, the island roses pale against the sea-blue cloth, the storm flung uselessly at the black windows. The family was seated. She had glimpsed them all week and never met them, a brother, an aunt, cousins, a scatter of summer guests, and the senior staff too, the once-a-season democracy of it, everyone in their good clothes by candlelight. Pine was there, the resort suit, halfway down the table with a glass already in his hand. And at the head of the table stood Mrs. Cross, gray and upright, and beside the head of the table, at the place of honor, the right hand of the host's empty chair, there was a single seat pulled out and waiting, and Mrs. Cross was looking at Nora and at that seat, and the whole room understood something Nora did not. Miss Quinn, Mrs. Cross said. Her voice carried the length of the room. You're seated here, he asked particularly. I should be serving, Nora said. Her own voice sounded far away. The dinner, somebody has to... It's handled. Sit, Miss Quinn. And there was something in the older woman's face, not cruelty. Nora saw that even then, even later when she tried to make it cruelty so the night would be simpler. Something that looked almost like mercy bracing itself. Sit down before he comes in. It will be easier if you're sitting. She sat. She didn't know what else to do. She sat in the place of honor at the head of a table she'd laid herself, in her plain good dress, with 40 people looking at her, and the empty chair beside her, the host's chair, the owner's chair, waited. Pine lifted his glass an inch, his eyes bright and unkind over the rim. "Well," he said, to the room, to the empty chair, in the carrying drawl of a man enjoying himself. "Shall we begin without him? He does like to keep a room waiting. Though I'd have thought, with the offer on the table and the board's patience running out, even Elias Thorne might come to his own dinner on time." A soft laugh from somewhere. "Where is our host? Still down with his boats? The man owns half this coast, and you'll find him changing the oil himself. It would be charming if it weren't costing me a fortune in delay. The man owns half this coast. You'll find him changing the oil himself." The words went into her slowly, the way cold water finds the gaps in a coat. She was aware of the candle smoke and the wax and rose smell of the room she'd built, of the warm weight of 40 stairs, of the empty chair beside her with its carved back and its waiting place of honor. She was aware, distantly, of her own hands wanting a task and finding none. And she was aware, this was the part that started the slow, cold turning, that she had heard a man on a jetty say the oil himself once before, in a different voice, about a different person, and that the two sentences were leaning toward each other across the whole week, like the two halves of a thing about to close. Something cold and enormous began, very slowly, to move through Nora. She heard the boathouse door, somewhere far off, and then the sea door, and then footsteps in the hall, and the room shifted the way a room shifts when the person it has been waiting for arrives. Mrs. Cross straightened. She set one hand flat on the back of the host's chair, the chair beside Nora's, as if to hold it for the man who was coming, and she lifted her head, and in the formal voice of 30 years of ritual, she said, to the whole assembled house, "The house welcomes home Mr. Elias Thorne." And everyone stood. Nora stood too. Her body did it before her mind could stop it, the reflex of a week of standing when the room stood, and she was already on her feet, already turning toward the door with everyone else, when the name and the direction and the empty chair beside her all came together at once and met in the middle of her, the memory of a chipped enamel mug and a terrible cup of coffee, and her own voice saying, "Rich and a coward, you can quote me," and a man saying, "I won't tell him, I won't tell him, I won't." He came through the door wet to the skin, his hair dark with rain, his eyes already on her and only on her across the whole gold length of the room. And he did not look like a captain. Stripped of the canvas jacket, in the stormlight, with the entire household risen to its feet around him and his name still hanging in the air, he looked like exactly what he was, what he had been the entire time, what she had told to its face that it was a coward. The man who owned the boat she'd boarded by mistake, and the line, and the island, and the house, and the candles, and the very chair she was standing beside. The candlelight she'd made swam and doubled. The roses she'd cut leaned out of their glasses, and the sea-blue cloth she'd laid ran the length of the table like water. And every beautiful thing in the room was something her own hands had built, for the people who had watched her not know. The smell of the hot wax turned, in an instant, sickening. She stood with her plain good dress and her level chin in a room she had saved, and felt the floor of her whole life tilt under her, the way the launch deck had tilted on the first morning. Except that this time, there was nothing to grab. The captain, Elias Thorne, the owner, the man who had let her. He crossed the room toward her. He did not sit. He stopped at his chair, his hand near hers on the white cloth, and the whole house watched. And he said, low, only for her, with everything he had in it, "Nora, let me explain, please. Not here. Come outside. Let me. Don't." It came out of her barely above a breath. She was aware of every face. She was aware of Pine's pleasure, and the aunt's lifted eyebrow, and Mrs. Cross's braced grey mercy, and the candles she'd lit with her own hands, burning all down the table she'd laid for the people who'd known, all of them, the whole time, who he was. She was aware, most of all, of the thing inside her own chest folding shut, room by room, the way the house went dark when the power failed. "Don't say my name like that. Not in front of—" She stopped, steadied. When she spoke again, her voice was almost level, almost the calm of the kitchen in the weeds, and that was worse than tears would have been. "You let me. A whole week. I split my lunch with you. I taught you to wash a pot like you were some— I told you what I thought of you, to your face. And you sat there, and you let me. And you poured me coffee, and you let me make a—" The word fool would not come out. She would not give it to the room. "It wasn't like that," he said. "Nora, I swear to you, it was never." But the oldest thing she believed about herself had been waiting 2 years for a night like this one. And now it rose up and spoke in the only voice she had ever fully believed. The voice that said love was a wage, and she was only ever worth what she carried. And against that voice his quiet words had no weight at all. Maybe he had been amusing himself, it said, reasonably, gently, the way the cruelest thoughts always come. Maybe a bored rich man had found a poor girl who didn't know any better, and let her perform her little kindnesses for a week, because it passed the time, because it was novel, because nobody talks to him like a person, and wasn't that a charming game? Maybe everything down at that boathouse, the coffee and the sandwich and next season, and you should see the garden in spring, had been exactly what Pine thought it was. The diversion of a lonely king, costing him nothing, costing her everything. She had been useful. She had been useful as entertainment. She had walked into his world and made herself useful the way she always did. And the moment she stopped being useful, she would, as she had always known she would, disappear. "I have to go," she said. "There's no boat," Mrs. Cross said quietly. "The channel's closed till morning. There's nowhere to go tonight, Miss Quinn." And the kindness in it was unbearable, because it meant she had to stay. In this house, in this candlelight, in this man's house, his candles, his island, his everything, for a whole night, with nowhere on the earth to put herself. "Then I'll go in the morning," Nora said. "On the first one." She set her napkin down. She squared it once, flat against the cloth, an old habit. The last task her hands would do for this house. The linen was cool and smooth under her fingers, pressed by someone, by her 2 days ago in another life, and the small familiar rightness of squaring it steadied her the way it always had, the way a held railing steadies you over water. Behind her she could feel him still standing, feel the held breath of 40 people waiting to see whether she would break in front of them. She did not intend to give them that. She had given this house everything else it had asked for. Her composure she would keep. And then she walked the length of the table she had laid, past the roses she had cut, and the candles she had lit, and the 40 silent faces, with her chin level and her eyes dry. And she did not run, because running was for people who still had something to lose by being seen. And she went up the dark stairs to her narrow room under the eaves, and shut the door, and stood with her back against it in the dark, and only then, when no one could see, did she let herself slide down to the floor and put her face in her hands. The narrow room had gone cold with the power still out, and she sat on the bare boards with her back to the door and the storm filling the window, and she let the dark hold her, because the dark, at least, wanted nothing. Rain ran down the glass in long silver ropes. The whole house ticked and settled below her, full of people who had known. And she pressed the heels of her hands hard against her eyes until the colors came. And she did not cry, because crying was a thing you did when someone might come to help. And she had taught herself young that no one was coming. He came up an hour later. She heard him on the stairs. She knew his step now. She hated that she knew his step. And then the floorboard outside her door. And then nothing for a long time. A man standing on the other side of a door, not knocking. Nora. Through the wood. Low. I'm not going to come in. I need you to know one thing, and then I'll go. And you can leave in the morning and never see me again if that's what you want. And I'll put you on the boat myself. But I need you to know it wasn't a game. You weren't. His voice did something it had never done on the bright, easy mornings. The floorboard outside the door took his weight and went quiet, as if he had sat down against the frame. Everyone who comes onto this island wants something. Everyone. Since I was a boy. They want the name, or the money, or the access, or the story. And they talk to me in the voice you use for a thing you're trying to get. And I learned to hear it before they finished their first sentence. And then a woman got on the wrong boat and asked me if the coffee was a captain's only situation, and told me I'd never make foreman. And she wanted nothing. Nothing. She just talked to me like I was a person standing in front of her. A breath came against the wood, close to the latch, warm where the rest of the room was cold. And I couldn't. I couldn't make myself end it. Every morning I meant to tell you, and every morning you'd hand me the pot, and I'd think, one more. Just one more morning where someone talks to me like that. It was the most selfish thing I've ever done. And I knew it was selfish when I did it. And I did it anyway. Because I was starving, Nora. And you were the first warm thing in 3 years. That's the truth. That's all of it. I'm sorry. Through the wood, his voice came low and close, and she could feel the warmth of it, almost. The way you feel a fire through a wall. And that was the cruelty of it. That the voice she'd taught to say good morning was on the other side of 2 inches of pine, telling her the one thing she'd have given anything to believe on any other night. She turned her cheek against the cool door. Part of her, the oldest part, sat very still and listened the way an animal listens, waiting for the trick, certain there was a trick, because there was always a trick. She sat with her back against the door and her knees pulled up, and she said nothing, because if she opened her mouth, the level voice would crack. And she had spent her whole life not letting them see it crack. And after a while the floorboard creaked, and his step went away down the stairs, and the storm went on against the window, and Nora Quinn stayed on the floor of a borrowed room on a stranger's island, and learned again the only lesson she had ever really trusted, that warmth has a price, and the bill always comes, and it always, always has her name on it. The storm blew itself out before dawn, the way summer storms do, and left the world rinsed and impossibly soft, the sea flat pewter under a sky going pink at its edge. Nora was packed before the gulls. 2 bags, 4 minutes, the way she'd come. She left the narrow room exactly as she'd found it, the bed squared, the window full of calm, and she went down the back stairs and out the sea door, into the cool of the new morning, to wait for the first boat off the island and the rest of her life. Which would be, she had decided, somewhere in the long dark, fine. It would be fine. She had been fine before warmth, and she would be fine after it. She was good at fine. The morning was almost unbearably gentle, which felt like an insult. The storm had scrubbed the air until it ached, and the sea lay down pewter and mild, as if it had never thrown a fit in its life. And the wet stones of the path gave up the smell of rain and warming rock as the first sun touched them. Nora walked through all that softness with her 2 bags and her hard-won fine, and the worse the morning behaved, the more she gripped the certainty she'd built in the dark, that she had been fine before warmth, and would be fine after, that fine was a thing she was genuinely good at, that she would not be the girl who mistook a kindness for a key. Mrs. Cross was on the jetty. She was standing at the end of the stone, in the grey-gold light, alone, upright in her precise grey, and she had Nora's curling reference folder in her 2 hands, the same folder Nora had clutched on the bus a lifetime ago, that she'd left behind in the office in her flight from the table. Theo was down by the bollards, readying the small launch, pretending with great effort not to listen. You forgot this, Mrs. Cross said. Keep it, Nora said. I won't need a reference from here. I'd rather not explain where I worked for a week. Take the folder, Miss Quinn. Mrs. Cross held it out, and when Nora took it, she felt that something had been added to it, clipped to the top. A single sheet of heavy house paper, covered in a hand so disciplined, it looked engraved. I wrote that last night, after. You may read it on the boat, or burn it. It's yours either way. But I'll tell you what the last line says, because I find I want to have said it out loud once before you go. She drew a breath, and the iron in her face did not soften so much as set differently, the way stone sets. It says, "You have the finest service instinct I have seen in 30 years in this house, and that you are the only person in all that time to treat the man who owns it as a man, and not as a fortune with a pulse." Nora looked down at the paper. The last line was there, exactly as spoken, in that engraved hand. She read it twice. 30 years ago, Mrs. Cross said, to the water, not to Nora, I was the girl on the staff, and the man of this house, not Elias. His father, Augustus, when he was young and I was younger, looked at me the way you've been looked at all this week. And I let myself believe it for one summer exactly the way you let yourself believe it. And then the family made it clear what such a thing costs and who pays it. And I was given a choice that was not a choice. And I stayed in this house for 30 years in gray. And I was very good. And I told myself I had chosen well. The gulls came back over the washed water. Mrs. Cross watched them as if they were the point of the sentence. Her voice did not break. It was worse, somehow, that it did not break. I polished his nameplate the morning he died, and every morning since. I've spent 30 years being the person who tells the staff girl to stop, because I stopped. And stopping was the great accomplishment of my life, and I could not bear for it to have been for nothing. She turned, finally, and looked at Nora, and put one hand flat on the cold stone rail between them, the salt grit of it under her palm, the way she had put it on the back of his chair the night before. I was wrong to tell you to stop. I told you to stop because I could not forgive myself for not having been brave. That is the truth, and it is mine, and I should not have made you carry it. I am sorry, Miss Quinn. A pause, and the smell of rain still coming off the warming stones. Don't get on the boat because a frightened old woman taught you that warmth has to be paid for. Some of us simply weren't allowed to keep ours. That isn't the same as it not being real. It was the longest speech Nora would ever hear her give, and the only apology. And it cost her. Nora could see exactly what it cost her. This woman, to whom form was the last dignity, breaking form on a jetty, in front of a 19-year-old who would tell the whole kitchen by lunch. Nora's throat had gone tight. She put her hand on the cold rail too, an inch from the older woman's, not quite touching, which was as much as either of them could do. It was real, Nora said. Down at the boathouse. I know it was. That's the part that... She stopped, squared the folder. That's the part that's hard. If it had been a game, I could just be angry, but I think it was real. And he still let me stand up in front of all of you not knowing, and I don't know how to hold both of those at once. No, Mrs. Cross agreed. It is the hardest thing there is to hold. He should not have let it go so long. She looked past Nora's shoulder, up the path toward the house, and something shifted in her face. You may want to put it down for a moment, though, because here comes the man himself, with no coat on, at 6 in the morning, looking as if he hasn't slept either. And I have worked for the Thorns for 30 years, and I have never once seen one of them run. Something in Nora's chest pulled tight at the words, a knot she'd spent the whole night tying deliberately, and she felt it resist coming loose. It would have been easier to leave angry, Anger she could carry onto a boat and live inside for years. She'd done it before. What the older woman was offering her instead was harder to hold than any grievance. The possibility that the warm thing had been real, and had still been allowed to hurt her, and that both could be true at once without canceling. Nora turned. Elias was coming down the path from the house, fast, coatless in the cold dawn, and he was indeed nearly running, and behind him, at a more furious pace, came Pine with his leather folder and his outrage flapping, and the morning was suddenly full of the day's first reckoning arriving all at once. Thorne, the answer. I need the board's answer. It's Friday. You said... Pine caught him at the head of the jetty, planted himself. I have a plane. I have a board. I have a very generous offer that expires the moment I'm on that plane. And you have been dodging me for 3 days to play sailor, and I'll have your answer now, in plain words, or I'll have it as a no, and you can watch this island rot. Elias stopped. For a moment he didn't look at Pine at all. He looked down the jetty at Nora, at the 2 bags, at the folder in her hands, and Nora watched him understand that she was leaving, and watched him decide something, and watched. This was the part she would turn over for the rest of her life. Watched him do the difficult thing in the right order. He turned to Pine first. He did not rush it. The answer is no, Elias said. Quiet, plain. The captain's voice, the voice from the boat. Except that now she could hear in it the thing she'd always heard and never placed. Not the deference of a man who served the island, but the weight of a man who was the island. I'm not selling. Not the line, not the house, not 1 foot of the shore. Tell the board the Thorn line isn't for sale while I'm alive to run it, and I intend to run it a long time. Personally, with my own hands, on my own water, where everyone can see exactly who I am. He held Pine's stare. You can keep your plane. You're insane, Pine said. Do you know what you're walking away from? You could be free of this place. Cash, anonymity, never set foot on this rock again. I'm offering you the exit and you're... I know what you're offering. And here Elias's eyes went, just for a second, to Nora. You're offering me a way to never be looked at again. I thought I wanted that. I've thought I wanted that for 3 years. He shook his head, slowly. I'd rather be looked at. Go home, Mr. Pine. Pine stared at him, then at Nora, calculating even now, and whatever he saw made him laugh once, short and disbelieving, and snap his folder shut. All this, he said, for a housemaid. And he said it to wound, and it landed exactly nowhere, because Elias had already stopped listening and turned away, and Pine was left holding his expensive offer in the cold, while Theo, beaming, pointedly readied the launch to take him, and only him, off the island. Then it was just the 2 of them, and the water, and Mrs. Cross withdrawing up the jetty with a tact that was its own small grace, taking Theo and his enormous grin with her. The gulls had come back to a washed, bright world, wheeling and crying over water gone the soft gold of early sun, and the air smelled of salt and warm, wet stone, and the last of the rain steaming off. Down at the bollards, the launch knocked gently against the jetty, rope creaking, waiting to carry her away. Nora stood with a bag in each hand and her heart doing something complicated, and she watched the man who had just walked away from a fortune for reasons she didn't dare assign, and she made herself hold still and not read into it, the way she'd spent the whole week not reading into things. Except that the not reading had cost her badly once already, and she wasn't sure she had it left in her. Elias came the last of the way down the stone, slowly now, all the run gone out of him, and stopped a careful distance from Nora, his hands open at his sides, nothing in them, no coffee, no token, no folder, Nothing to hide behind for once. "I'm not going to ask you to stay," he said. "Good," Nora said, "because I'm getting on the boat." "I know. I'll put you on it myself, like I said. I meant that." He looked at her, the dawn coming up gold behind him off the water. "I only came down to give you one thing, and it isn't a job, and it isn't an apology, because I already made the apology through a door like a coward, and you don't owe me a second chance to do it better. It's just a true thing, and then you can go." He breathed, and the salt wind off the water moved the hair at his temple. "The first morning, on the boat, when you asked if I worked the line, I said, 'A long time.' That was the only honest answer I gave you all week, and I gave it because it was the only true sentence about myself I had left that didn't have the name in it. I've spent my whole life being the most valuable thing in every room, and the least known. And then you got on the wrong boat, and for 1 week I got to find out what it's like to be chosen for nothing, for no reason, for splitting a sandwich. You keep thinking you were useful to me." His voice caught on the word that had run under everything she believed about herself, though he couldn't have known it. You were the opposite of useful. You were the first thing in years I wanted that I couldn't get any use out of at all. I didn't keep you near me because you fixed things. I kept failing to tell you the truth because you were the one thing on this entire island I didn't want to put to work. Do you understand? Not because you're useful, Nora. Because it's you." The level voice she had held all night, the dry-eyed calm she had walked the length of the table with, came apart very quietly, right there on the stone, because he had reached past everything and put his hand on the exact wound, the lie she had never said aloud to a single soul, and answered it, without ever having been told it was there. "You don't get to know that about me," she said, and now her voice did crack, finally, after 30 hours and 25 years. "You don't get to be the one who... I never told you about being useful. I never told anybody." "You didn't have to," he said. "I know what it sounds like when someone talks to you in the voice of a thing they're trying to keep. You taught me you can just talk to a person and have it be nothing and not want anything back." The smallest, most careful step closer, and he stopped, leaving the last of the distance for her. "So here's me, talking to you, wanting nothing back. You can get on the boat. The garden really is better in spring. The coffee's finally drinkable. And there's a foreman's job open. Except I've decided the position should go to someone who'll tell me when I'm being a coward. And I can only think of one applicant. And she has a folder full of references, and the worst opinion of the owner I've ever heard in my life." He almost smiled. He didn't quite. "Stay, don't stay. But stay because you want to, not because anyone needs you to. That's the only way I'll have you. The wanting kind, not the needing kind. I've had enough of being needed to last 100 years. Nora looked at the boat. Theo had loaded a furious pine and was holding the launch against the stone, studiously examining a cleat. She looked at the folder in her hands with its engraved last line. She looked at the man with no coat and nothing in his hands, who owned everything she could see and was standing on his own jetty with his whole self open like a door, waiting, actually waiting, leaving the distance for her to close or not, for a broke girl with 2 bags to decide. She thought about her mother, folding linens at midnight. We earn our place, Nora. And she thought, with a clarity that arrived like the sun coming over the water, no, not this place. This place I don't have to earn. This one, I just get to want. For a moment she just stood and felt it move through her. The unfamiliar shape of being allowed to want a thing without first proving she'd earned it. It didn't feel safe. It felt like stepping off the pier onto a deck still sliding away, that same lurch in the stomach. That same instant where the body insists you've made a mistake. But she had boarded the wrong boat once already, and it had carried her exactly where she needed to go. And she was beginning to suspect that the wrongest thing she could do now was get on the right one. She set the 2 bags down on the stone. "I'm keeping the folder," she said. "The last line, mostly." "Keep it," he said, and his voice wasn't steady either now. "It's true. And I'm not taking the foreman job. Not yet. I'm taking my old job, the probation one, the one I actually interviewed for, the honest way, before I knew who you were. Because I want to be able to say I'd have stayed for the work and the people and the garden, even if the captain had stayed a captain." She picked up 1 bag again, just one, and held the other out to him, and after a second, carefully, like a man handed something fragile, he took it. "But you're carrying a bag. Owners carry bags on this island now. New rule. I'm instituting it." "I'll allow it," he said. "And you're never making the coffee unsupervised again." "I would never dream of it." She didn't kiss him. Not there. Not yet. With Theo failing to not watch, and Mrs. Cross a gray sentinel at the top of the jetty, and the gulls coming back to a washed, bright world. There would be time. That was the whole astonishing point she was beginning to understand. There would be time. She just stood with him in the gold morning. 1 bag each, the storm gone and the season barely begun. And she said the thing she'd said on the terrace 100 years ago. The small, ordinary thing that had cracked him open the first time, the only spell either of them had ever needed. "Good morning, Captain," she said. And this time, finally, he smiled. All the way, like a man who'd remembered how. And he said it back. The island in late summer was a different country. By August, the garden had thrown everything it had at the season, and the terrace lunches Nora had spent June ironing tablecloths for finally got eaten. Because Nora ate them, at the long table, in the gold light, with her shoes off under her chair, and a man who owned half the coast passing her the bread. The family came and went, the way families do. The aunt decided to approve of her. The brother lost to her twice at cards and demanded a 3rd game on principle. Pine did not come back. The Thorn line ran its crossings the same as it had for 100 years, the big Wren Queen for the day trippers, and the little Mara T for the people who knew. And most mornings now, the Mara T was captained by its owner, with a coordinator turned deckhand standing in the bow pretending to supervise. And the coffee aboard it had become, against all the odds and a century of tradition, genuinely good. She had asked him about the name once, early on. The Mara T. She'd seen the faded photograph in the boathouse window the first night, and never asked. And then one evening, with the launch rocking gentle on her lines, she did. "My mother," Elias said. "Mara Thorn. She used to take me across on this boat when I was small, before the big ferries, when it was the only one. She'd let me think I was steering." He turned the little brass token over his knuckles the way he did, and this time he opened his hand and showed her. A Ferry token, worn smooth, from the line's first season, with a wren stamped on one face. "She gave me this when I was 6. Told me it meant I could ride any boat in the fleet, any time, for free, for life, as if I'd ever have to pay." His mouth twisted, but gently now, the old wound gone to a scar you could touch. "I used to carry it to remind myself that everything here was already mine, and none of it had ever made me happy. After the dinner, after you, I started carrying it to remind myself of the morning a woman tried to pay her own fare on a boat I owned, and told me my coffee would keep me from a promotion I couldn't be given." He pressed it into her palm and closed her fingers over it. "Here, you've got more right to it than I do. You actually rowed the wrong boat. I just steered it." The token sat warm in her palm where his hand had left it, lighter than it had any right to be for everything it carried. The wren worn nearly smooth by a boy's thumb across 30 years. She felt the weight of being handed someone's whole grief, and asked to keep it safe. And under that, finer and stranger, the weight of being trusted with it at all. She who had spent her life certain that the things people handed her were always, in the end, a job. "I'm not taking your dead mother's fairy token, Elias." "You're taking it. New rule. You're always instituting rules. Let me have one." He folded her hand around it. "Besides, it's only good on the thorn line, and you live on the thorn line now." Seemed practical. She kept it. She wore it on a thin chain under her collar, where the faded photograph's eyes had used to be the only company in that boathouse. And sometimes, when the day got loud and the old voice came whispering that she was only worth what she carried, she'd press her thumb to the wren through her shirt and remember that she had been wanted, once, on a cold, bright morning, for absolutely no useful reason at all, and that the wanting had turned out to be the kind that stayed. Mrs. Cross stayed too, of course. She was not a woman remade overnight. She still ran the house to a standard that made the kitchen sweat, still said, "Let me be clear," before delivering a verdict, still wore grey. But she had started that autumn, keeping fresh roses on the late Augustus Thorne's desk beside the polished nameplate. The wild white ones from down by the boathouse, not the hothouse kind. And she did it openly now, where the staff could see, and no one said a word. And once, Nora caught her teaching a brand new probation girl how to lay a table for 12 in under 9 minutes, and overheard her say, in the flat managerial voice that hid everything, "The last one who could do it this fast married the owner, so mind you don't get ideas." Which was, from Vivian Cross, very nearly a joke, and very nearly a blessing, and entirely a door held open. Theo told the story to everyone. He could not help it. It was the best thing that had ever happened to him, second-hand. He told the new staff, and the day trippers, and anyone who'd stand still on the jetty, how the boss's wife— they weren't married, Nora kept correcting him, not yet, and he kept ignoring her— had boarded the wrong boat, the private one, the Mara T, and bossed the owner of the island around for a solid week, taught him to wash his own coffee pot, called him captain to his face, and told him, the actual Elias Thorne, that the man who owned the place was rich and a coward, and he could quote her. "And he never corrected her," Theo would finish, delighted every single time, as if it were the punchline and the moral both. A whole week. The man owns the ocean, and he just let her think he was crew. You know why? And here Theo would drop his voice, because he'd worked it out, the way the young sometimes work out the only thing that matters. Because she was the first person who ever talked to him like he was a person, so he wasn't about to correct that. Would you? He was not wrong. It was the moral and the punchline both. On the last warm evening of the season, before the September swell came in and the crossings turned hard, Nora went down to the boathouse with 2 halves of a sandwich and found him already there in the gold light, on his back under the engine cowling, exactly where she'd found him the first night, a man looking after his boats. She sat on the upturned crate. She put his half beside him on the bench. She watched the light pour off the water onto the rafters, the way it had the night she'd glanced back through the doors and seen him turning the token over, listening to something that had stopped playing. It hadn't stopped playing. That was the thing she knew now that she hadn't known then. It had only been waiting for someone to get on the wrong boat. He slid out from under the cowling, wiped his hands, took up his half of the sandwich. The water slapped the hull. Somewhere up the hill, the house began to light its windows one by one against the dusk, every one of them his, and none of them the reason she was sitting here. "Eat your dinner, Captain," she said. "And then I'm teaching you to splice a line, because if you're going to keep this fleet, you should at least look like you've earned it." "I own the fleet," he said mildly. "That's exactly the attitude that's held back your career." She bumped her shoulder against his, the old gesture, the first one. "Good evening, Elias." He looked at her in the last of the gold, the wren token a small warm shape under her collar, the season turning over around them toward whatever came next, and he set down the sandwich, and he reached over and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear where her pen usually went. Slow, unhurried. A man with all the time in the world for the only thing he'd ever actually wanted. "Good evening," he said.